Hey guys, it's Paul here, Gospel of Mark class, and we're picking up in chapter 10, verse 1, and Jesus is going to talk about marriage and divorce. So let's jump into the chapter. Verse 1, it says, "Then he arose from there and came to the region of Judea by the other side of the Jordan, and multitudes gathered to him again, and as he was accustomed, he taught them again. The Pharisees came and asked him, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?' Testing him." So here you have Jesus, and he comes over to the region of Judea, crosses the other side of the Jordan there, and the multitudes are still in Judea. They're crazy about him, so they gather to him, and he teaches them. Jesus is always ready to teach those who want to hear his teaching and those who truly want to be transformed by it. But also the Pharisees come, and they're not looking for an honest answer. It says they're testing him. So they're basically looking to trap him into speaking against Moses or against popular rabbinic interpretations of the law concerning divorce. But Jesus is going to give them an honest answer. It may not be the answer that they want. So verse 3, he says, and he answered and said to them, "What did Moses command you?" In other words, you tell me what Moses said. And then they said, verse 4, they said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her." And Matthew 9:13, Matthew adds, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" So really, that's the question that they're asking, and they pose it to Jesus, and he says, well, what did Moses say? Well, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her. And the passage here, when they say Moses, the reference is Deuteronomy 24:1, and it says that when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, and that's the key passage there, the uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, sends her out of the house. So this uncleanness here that's mentioned in Deuteronomy 24:1, there's a couple different schools of thought. There were different rabbis, and you had Shammai, and Shammai interpreted the uncleanness basically as moral failure, such as adultery, which is, I would say, the closest to the correct interpretation. Hillel, on the other hand, interpreted it, in addition to any moral fault, such as adultery, it could also include anything which caused annoyance or embarrassment to a husband, would be considered legitimate grounds for divorce. So Hillel basically expanded this thing that Moses said and interpreted Deuteronomy 24:1, that the uncleanness obviously would refer to adultery, moral failure, but it could also encompass a very broad scope of anything from burning toast to aging prematurely, or really just anything. And so what does Jesus have to say about this? Well, verse 5, "And Jesus answered and said to them, 'Because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote you this precept.'" I'll say that again. Jesus answered and said, "Because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote you this precept." So Jesus here is putting his finger on the real issue and the real problem with the Pharisees at this point. They have a hardness of heart, and Jesus is going to give his disciples a slightly different answer, because they're going to ask him the same question in the next verse, or in a few verses rather. But here he's saying, Pharisees, you're asking me this question about marriage and all that, but really the whole reason that Moses ever gave any exclusion was because of a hardness of heart. And so Jesus goes to the root, and relationships break down because of sinfulness or hardness in the human heart. Adultery begins as a thought in the heart before it's ever manifested on the outside. And, if we look at the world today, there are petty reasons that lead to divorce, but they all begin somewhere back in the heart. So what Jesus does with the Pharisees here is he takes them all the way back to creation to demonstrate God's original intent for marriage. And so he says in verse 6, but from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. There's a word for today. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So he's going back to creation and he's saying, look, God's intention was, there's a man and a woman, and they start out as a boy and girl, and they grow up in their parents' household, but then they're to leave their parents and come together and be married one and another. And it's it's this thing that God does. It's a covenant before the Lord. And what I refer to concerning marriage today, because there's so much confusion, it's the covenant between a man and a woman that has been ordained by God for life. And Scripture tells us it's between a man and a woman. And people would argue that today, but you always have to divert from Scripture if you're looking for some other way to see things. So we stick with the clarity of Scripture. He says, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. And it doesn't say that they shall remain two people. It says they shall become one flesh. And it's a mystery. It's a mysterious thing. And it's sacred. And really, it's a picture of Christ's relationship with the church. That's what marriage represents, Scripture teaches us. And here, so verse 9, Jesus says, therefore, since this is something that God has joined together, this isn't a human contract. There's an element of a human contract, but this isn't some sort of just business contract that's come together that anyone can just, okay, tear it up, just kidding, and all that sort of thing. And I'm not belittling the pain that people experience having gone through a divorce, but it's something more than a human contract, and it's something that God has joined together. And God's never going to join two men together, and he's never going to join two women together. He's just not going to do that. So what God has joined together, a man and a woman in the covenant of marriage, let not man separate. So Pharisees, there's your answer, that it has, if people's hearts weren't hard, marriage would work. And it is God's intention that the two should become one flesh, till death do us part, and all that. And it's something that God has joined together. So Moses, because you have hard hearts, Moses gave you a concession, and that concession is really marital infidelity, as the grounds by which a divorce could become permissible. So that's the answer that he gives them. It's really hardness of heart, but that wasn't God's intention for marriage. It was to be a lifelong institution. So let's look at here Jesus's explanation, or his answer that he gives to the disciples. So verse 10, it says, in the house, his disciples also asked him again about the same matter. So the disciples say, hey, Jesus, we heard you give that answer to the Pharisees, but what were you saying? And, what is marriage about? So verse 11, it says, so he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So Jesus really is giving a clear interpretation of the passage in Deuteronomy 24:1, where divorce is permissible if there is an uncleanness, but Jesus interprets the uncleanness as marital infidelity or adultery. So that's what Jesus says here. And so he gives the one answer, which is a correct answer to the Pharisees, and they have a hard heart. But here he gives another, simply just a simple, clear answer to the disciples. And to the disciples who ask Jesus a question, if they have ears to hear, he'll give us a very simple answer, and we can come to the Lord, and he'll give us answers if there's things that we're not clear about. So let's wrap that up, and then we'll resume in chapter 10, verse 13, next video. God bless.